Hello and welcome. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, you don't need to think about where you've been or what tomorrow might ask of you. All you need to do is settle in, get comfortable, and let the world slow down for a while. In this series, Sleepy Journeys, we'll be traveling together. Sometimes to real places. Deep forests, quiet rivers, forgotten paths. Sometimes to places that couldn't possibly exist, but feel calm enough that they probably should. There's no rush, no danger, and no destination we need to reach. The journey itself is enough. Before you get cozy though, take just a moment to gently support the channel. If you enjoy these quiet stories, consider liking the video and subscribing, so other sleepy souls wandering the internet late at night can find their way here too. You can also leave a comment with where you're listening from. It's comforting to know we're all resting together, even from far away. Now, find a position that feels easy. Let your breathing soften. There's nothing you need to follow closely and nothing important you might miss. When you're ready, we'll begin our journey. Slowly, calmly, and one peaceful step at a time. In the middle of the 19th century, the idea of the American West carried a quiet power. It was not yet a place most people could describe clearly. For many, California existed more as a promise than a destination, a distant region spoken of in letters, newspapers, and conversations held beside hearth fires. It was described as fertile, mild in climate, and open to those willing to make the journey. In the spring of 1846, this promise was enough to move entire families. Men sold farms they had worked for years. Women packed household tools, seeds, and clothing into wooden wagons. Children were taught that the journey would be long, but that it would lead to a better life. Few had maps that showed more than rivers and vague mountain ranges. Fewer still understood what lay beyond them. The road west began quietly. In towns across the Midwest, wagons gathered one by one. Oxen were harnessed, wheels were checked and rechecked. Supplies were measured, counted, and adjusted to fit the space available. Nothing extra could be carried. Nothing essential could be forgotten. Each wagon became a small, moving household. Flour, dried meat, beans, rice, and coffee were packed in sacks and barrels. Cast iron cookware was tied beneath wagon frames. Spare clothing was folded carefully, knowing that replacements would be impossible to find once the trail began. Rifles were carried not for conflict, but for hunting and protection against animals. Most travelers were not adventurers. They were farmers, craftsmen, laborers, and their families. They were accustomed to hard work, but not to prolonged uncertainty. The journey west required faith not only in the destination, but in the road itself, a road that would stretch for months across plains, rivers, deserts, and mountains. By late spring, many converged on Independence, Missouri, one of the main departure points for Western travel. Here, the movement became visible. Wagons lined dirt roads, animals grazed in crowded fields. People exchanged advice, rumors, and warnings. Some had already turned back from earlier attempts. Others spoke confidently of routes they claimed were safe and efficient. There was no single authority. Wagon trains formed through agreement rather than command. Leadership was often shared or elected. Decisions were made collectively, sometimes slowly, sometimes under pressure. Among those preparing to leave were the families who would later be known as the Donner-Reed Party. George Donner and his brother Jacob were respected, experienced men. They were not reckless. They had traveled before and understood the need for planning. James Reed, another prominent member, brought both ambition and confidence to the group. At this stage, there was little reason for concern. The trail ahead was well known. Thousands had traveled it before. Supplies were adequate. Spirits were high. The weather was favorable. Children ran between wagons. Evenings were filled with conversation and anticipation. The road west did not yet feel dangerous. It felt purposeful. As the wagons finally began to move, leaving the last settled towns behind, the journey took on its true shape. Progress would be measured not in miles alone, but in endurance. Each day would depend on weather, animals, and the collective strength of the group. Behind them, familiar landscapes slowly faded. Ahead, the continent opened, and with it a journey that would test every assumption they carried with them about distance, preparation, and the limits of human resolve. Once the wagons were fully committed to the trail, daily life settled into a steady rhythm. Movement began early each morning. Before sunrise, fires were lit and breakfast prepared quickly, often little more than bread or porridge warmed over coals. Animals were gathered, harnessed, and inspected. Oxen, chosen for their strength and endurance rather than speed, became the most valuable members of the journey. The wagons moved slowly. Progress depended on terrain, weather, and the condition of the animals. On flat ground, the train could cover a respectable distance. In muddy stretches or near riverbanks, progress slowed to a crawl. Each obstacle demanded patience rather than force. Walking was more common than riding. Most adults traveled on foot beside their wagons to reduce strain on the animals. Children alternated between walking and riding, depending on their age and strength. The wagons carried supplies more than people. The trail itself was visible but imperfect. Ruts left by previous wagon trains guided the way, though storms and traffic often erased them. Rivers marked both landmarks and challenges. Some could be forded safely. Others required wagons to be unloaded and ferried piece by piece, a process that could consume an entire day. Meals were practical and repetitive by necessity. Flour and water became dough, baked in pans or wrapped around sticks. Salted meat was rationed carefully. Coffee, when available, offered comfort beyond its nourishment. Nothing was wasted. Every sack was monitored. Clothing wore down quickly. Dust-coated fabric during dry stretches, mud-soaked hymns during rain. Shoes softened, cracked, and required repair. Small sewing kits were as essential as tools. These repairs were done in the evenings, by firelight, when the wagons finally stopped for the day. Evenings brought brief rest. Wagons were arranged in loose circles or lines, depending on space and terrain. Animals were tended and allowed to graze where grass was available. Fires burned low. Conversations stayed close to home. How far they had traveled, how the animals were holding up, what the next stretch might bring. There was little privacy. Families slept inside wagons or beneath them, using blankets and whatever shelter could be improvised. Nights were often quiet, broken only by animal sounds and wind moving through grass. At this stage, illness was rare. The pace, though demanding, was manageable. Spirits remained steady. The trail had not yet demanded sacrifice beyond fatigue. Most travelers still believed the greatest challenge lay ahead, in the mountains spoken of vaguely in conversation. The plains felt endless, but not threatening. The road continued westward day after day. The wagons creaked. The oxen leaned into their yokes. The group learned how to move together, adjusting to one another's pace and habits. For now, the journey felt controlled. The unknown remained distant, still confined to the horizon rather than pressing in from all sides. As the wagon train moved farther from settled land, the group's identity slowly became more defined. Travelers who had departed together out of convenience now depended on one another more fully. Decisions about pace, rest days, and river crossings required discussion. Small differences in judgment began to matter more than they had at the outset. George Donner emerged as a steady presence. He was older than many in the group, calm in manner and respected for his experience. His brother Jacob shared these qualities. Neither sought authority aggressively, but both were often deferred to when decisions had to be made. James Reed brought a different energy. He was decisive and confident, inclined toward efficiency and forward movement. At times, this made him effective. At other moments, it introduced tension. His opinions carried weight, but not always agreement. Leadership was informal. There was no strict hierarchy. Instead, influence shifted depending on circumstance. Some voices carried authority during mechanical problems. Others were listened to when illness or family concerns arose. This flexibility worked well while conditions were manageable. The party traveled alongside other emigrants for much of this early stage. Wagons joined and separated as needs changed. Some families fell behind and caught up again days later. Others chose different schedules entirely. The trail was shared, not owned. Children adapted quickly. They learned which wagons carried extra treats, which adults told the best stories, which stretches of the trail were easiest to walk. Their presence reminded the adults of what was at stake, even during moments of disagreement. Supplies were still adequate. Though some items wore down or were lost, nothing essential was yet gone. Animals remained strong. Grass was generally available. Water sources, though sometimes muddy, were sufficient. The group's pace reflected confidence. There was no urgency yet, no sense that time itself was becoming an enemy. Days were measured by distance covered, rather than by what might be lost. Even so, subtle changes were underway. The farther west they traveled, the less opportunity there was to turn back easily. Each mile forward increased commitment. The familiar landscapes of farms and towns were replaced by open plains and distant horizons. News traveled along the trail. Other immigrants spoke of conditions ahead. Some warned of difficult terrain later in the season. Others mentioned alternative routes that promised savings in time. These conversations were informal, often contradictory, and rarely verified. At first, they were treated as background noise. The Donna Reed party continued on the established path, confident that experience and preparation would carry them through. The road remained broad and visible. For now, the journey was still unfolding as expected. A long but manageable crossing toward a future that seemed increasingly real with each passing day. By early summer, the wagon train moved along routes that had already carried thousands before them. This portion of the journey followed what was commonly called the Oregon Trail, a wide corridor shaped by repeated use rather than formal construction. In places, the ground was deeply rutted by wheels. In others, grass had been worn thin by grazing animals. The trail existed not as a single line, but as a broad path of choices made by earlier travelers. The land itself felt open and exposed. Days passed under wide skies, with few landmarks beyond rivers, low hills, and distant bluffs. Navigation required attention, but not creativity. The route was familiar to guides, traders, and emigrants alike. Confidence came easily here. River crossings marked the rhythm of progress. Some were shallow enough to cross without unloading wagons. Others required care and planning. Wagons were sealed with pitch or tar where possible. Teams worked together, steadying wheels and guiding animals through slow-moving water. These moments demanded coordination, but rarely caused alarm. The trail encouraged cooperation. When a wagon broke an axle or lost a wheel, nearby travelers stopped to help. Tools were shared. Advice was given freely. Delays were accepted as part of the journey rather than setbacks. No one yet felt rushed. Hunting supplemented supplies. Occasionally, game was brought down along the way. Fresh meat was welcomed, though it required time to prepare and preserve. Strips were dried when possible, though salt was used sparingly. Hunting was practical, not recreational, and success depended on chance as much as skill. Weather shifted gradually. Warm days alternated with cooler nights. Rain turned sections of the trail slick and slow, but also refreshed grass for the animals. Storms were watched carefully, but they passed quickly. The environment demanded attention, not fear. The days blurred together. Morning routines, steady movement, evening camps. Children grew accustomed to the repetition. Adults learned how much they could push themselves without exhaustion. The animals set the pace more than any decision. Time still felt generous. There was an unspoken assumption that delays could be absorbed later, that progress would even out, that the mountains, though distant, would be crossed when the time came. Along the trail, stories circulated. Some travelers spoke of a new route farther ahead, a shortcut said to bypass difficult stretches and save weeks of travel. These stories were inconsistent. Details varied. Names were mentioned without context. For now, they remained just stories. The Donner Reed party continued forward on the familiar road, moving steadily westward, unaware that the greatest decision of their journey had not yet been made, only postponed. The trail was still known, and that familiarity made it easy to believe it would remain so. As summer advanced, conversations along the trail began to change. The road was still familiar, but time had become more noticeable. Days were longer now, yet the calendar continued to move forward. Experienced travelers understood that the Sierra Nevada could not be crossed safely once winter set in. Every decision was weighed against the season, even if only quietly. It was in this context that the idea of a shortcut gained strength. Travelers spoke of a man named Lansford Hastings, who had written a guidebook promoting a new route to California. According to the book, this route would shorten the journey by several hundred miles. It promised easier terrain, fewer river crossings, and a faster passage overall. The promise was appealing. A shorter route meant less strain on animals. It meant supplies would last longer. It meant reaching California before the rains and snows. For families with children and limited resources, these advantages were difficult to ignore. At Fort Bridger, the idea became more concrete. Here, emigrants paused to rest, trade, and gather information. Letters attributed to Hastings were circulated, claiming that the cutoff was safe and practical. Some travelers reported having spoken to messengers who insisted the route had already been tested. What was not clear was how thoroughly. No wagon train of significant size had yet completed the route. Most information came secondhand. Details were vague. Distances were estimated. The challenges were downplayed or dismissed entirely. The Donner Reed party discussed the option at length. There was no single moment of decision. Instead, the idea lingered. Some favored staying on the known trail, arguing that time lost could not be recovered through speculation. Others believed the risk was worth taking, especially if it meant avoiding delays later in the season. James Reed supported the shortcut. He believed efficiency mattered. He trusted that preparation and determination would compensate for uncertainty. George Donner was more cautious, but not dismissive. The group weighed the information they had, aware that no choice was without risk. Social pressure played a role. Other immigrants chose to attempt the cutoff. Some expressed confidence. Others hesitated openly, then followed anyway. The decision did not belong to the Donner Reed party alone, but unfolded in a shared atmosphere of expectation. Eventually, the group committed. They turned away from the main trail and toward the untested route. The moment itself was not dramatic. There was no clear marker. The road simply narrowed. The familiar ruts faded. The landscape felt quieter. At first, little seemed different. The ground was passable. Progress continued. Confidence remained intact. The promise of saved time lingered ahead just beyond the horizon. Only gradually did the reality assert itself. The shortcut did not shorten the journey. It reshaped it. And with that decision, the Donna Reed party stepped away from certainty. Not all at once, but enough that returning would soon become impossible. The change became noticeable within days. The trail narrowed further, losing the broad familiarity of the main route. Wagon ruts were faint or absent altogether. Instead of following a path shaped by thousands of wheels, the group now moved through terrain that offered little guidance. Progress slowed. Wagons encountered uneven ground more frequently. Vegetation pressed closer to the route. At times, the party had to stop and scout ahead, choosing directions based on judgment rather than certainty. Each pause cost time, though it was not yet counted carefully. The sense of isolation deepened. Fewer immigrants traveled nearby now. The shared movement that had defined earlier weeks began to thin. The trail no longer felt like a corridor, but like a sequence of decisions, each one leading further from the last. The environment demanded more effort. In places where the land rose sharply, wagons had to be double-teamed. Oxen strained against their yokes. Wheels slipped on loose ground. Men worked with axes and shovels, cutting through brush and leveling paths just wide enough to pass. These efforts were practical, not dramatic. They required patience rather than strength alone. Clearing a few hundred yards of trail could take hours. Progress was measured in short distances instead of miles. Time, once generous, began to feel conditional. Rest days were reconsidered. Camps were set up later in the evenings. Morning departures became more urgent. Still, no one spoke openly of failure. The belief that the shortcut would soon improve conditions remained. Communication within the group grew more focused. Decisions were discussed more frequently. Small disagreements surfaced and were resolved. Fatigue made tempers shorter, but cooperation continued. No one yet believed the situation was beyond control. Supplies were still intact. Food had not yet become scarce. Animals, though more tired, remained functional. The strain was noticeable, but manageable. What changed most was the rhythm. The predictable flow of the main trail had given way to uncertainty. Each day brought terrain that could not be anticipated. Some stretches were easier than expected. Others slowed the entire train. The landscape itself felt indifferent. It offered no clear guidance, no reassurance. Hills rose without explanation. Valleys ended abruptly. The route existed only because the wagons insisted upon it. Still, the group moved forward. Turning back was discussed only briefly and then dismissed. The distance already covered made reversal impractical. The promise of a shorter route still hovered just ahead, unproven but persuasive. The known road was now behind them, and with each step forward, it receded further, not just in distance, but in relevance. The land rose gradually at first, then with increasing insistence. The Wasatch Mountains presented themselves not as a single barrier, but as a succession of ridges, narrow valleys, and wooded slopes that resisted easy passage. For travelers accustomed to open plains, the change was immediate and demanding. Wagons could no longer move in long, uninterrupted stretches. The terrain forced frequent stops. Slopes had to be assessed carefully. In steeper sections, wagons were unloaded and hauled forward in stages. Oxen were pushed close to their limits, then rested, then pushed again. Wooded areas slowed progress further. Trees blocked the route entirely in places. Men worked with axes, clearing narrow corridors just wide enough for wagon wheels. This was slow, exhausting labor. Every cut cost energy and daylight. The effect on time became unmistakable. Days passed with little visible progress. Distances that once took hours now consumed entire days. The group began to calculate movement differently, not by miles but by obstacles cleared. Animals weakened. Oxen lost weight as grazing opportunities became inconsistent. Their pace slowed. Some showed signs of strain that could not be ignored. Each animal represented both transportation and future food. Losing one meant more than inconvenience. Morale shifted subtly. No panic surfaced, but optimism thinned. Conversations became quieter. Evenings were shorter. The novelty of the journey had faded, replaced by concentration and effort. Weather remained mostly fair, but the mountains created their own conditions. Cooler air settled into valleys. Shadows lingered longer. Mornings brought frost earlier than expected. These signs were noticed, but not fully reckoned with. The group still believed the worst lay behind them. Hastings' descriptions had suggested that once past this region, the route would open again. Many held on to this expectation even as evidence grew thin. Leadership was tested quietly. George Donner maintained a calm presence, encouraging patience. James Reed pressed for efficiency, urging longer workdays when possible. Their approaches differed, but neither sought open confrontation. Cooperation remained essential. The physical cost accumulated. Hands blistered from tools. Muscles ached constantly. Small injuries lingered longer than they should have. Rest never felt sufficient. Still, the wagons moved. Each cleared section became a small victory. Each campsite marked another day survived. No one yet spoke of failure or regret. The choice had been made, and the only available direction was forward. Behind them, the Wasatch Mountains closed slowly. Ahead, the route continued into terrain that offered no promise of ease, only the certainty that time, once abundant, was now being sped carefully, one difficult day at a time. Beyond the mountains, the land opened suddenly and without comfort. The Great Salt Lake Desert stretched out in a flat, pale expanse that offered neither shade nor guidance. From a distance, it appeared manageable, a wide, empty plain that could be crossed with steady effort. Up close, it revealed itself as a test of endurance and judgment. Water became the first concern. Streams disappeared. Grass thinned, then vanished altogether. What little vegetation existed was brittle and offered little nourishment for the animals. Every decision now had to account for how far the next reliable water source might be. The party attempted to cross the desert in stages. Travel was planned carefully. Some chose to move at night to spare the oxen from the heat. Others pushed forward during the day, hoping to reach firmer ground sooner. Neither approach proved easy. The ground itself was deceptive. Hard-packed salt flats gave way unexpectedly to soft, powdery surfaces that trapped wheels. Wagons sank and had to be dragged free. Animals struggled for traction, their hooves slipping as they pulled. Time dissolved into effort. There were no landmarks to mark progress. Distance was difficult to judge. The horizon remained unchanged no matter how far they traveled. Exhaustion set in quietly, without the drama of steep climbs or visible obstacles. Animals suffered greatly. Oxen weakened rapidly without adequate grazing. Some collapsed and could not be made to rise again. Decisions had to be made quickly. Whether to abandon wagons, redistribute loads, or press on regardless. Abandoned wagons were stripped of what could be carried. Non-essential items were left behind. Each choice reflected a narrowing of possibility, though it was rarely spoken of in those terms. Tempers shortened. Fatigue and thirst reduced patience. Arguments flared briefly, then faded. There was no energy for prolonged conflict. Cooperation, though strained, remained necessary. When water was finally found, it came with relief rather than celebration. The group rested longer than planned. Animals drank deeply. People rationed water carefully, aware of how easily it vanished. No one believed the desert crossing had been trivial. The desert had taken more than time. It had taken strength, animals, and confidence. It had stripped the journey of any remaining illusion that efficiency alone could ensure success. When the wagons finally left the salt flats behind, they did so thinner, slower, and more aware of their vulnerability. The shortcut had cost them dearly, and the season continued to advance, indifferent to the effort required to keep pace with it. After the desert, the land began to change again, but the sense of recovery was limited. The ground grew firmer. Vegetation returned in uneven patches. Streams appeared occasionally, though they were smaller and less reliable than before. These signs offered relief, but not restoration. The losses sustained during the crossing could not be undone. The wagons moved more slowly now, even on easier terrain. Animals that had survived the desert were weakened. Their pace was cautious, their endurance reduced. Rest days, once optional, became necessary. Each pause was measured against the calendar, which could no longer be ignored. By now, the group understood that they were behind schedule. The realization did not arrive all at once. It surfaced gradually, through comparison with expected distances, through the angle of the sun, through conversations with travelers who had remained on the main trail and now appeared ahead of them. This awareness changed how decisions were made. Rest was balanced against progress more carefully. Routes were chosen for reliability rather than speed. Even small delays were felt more sharply than before. Supplies were checked more frequently. Flour sacks were lighter. Meat was rationed more carefully. Hunting opportunities were limited and unpredictable. Nothing was wasted. Even so, consumption outpaced replenishment. Tensions surfaced in quiet ways. Disagreements over pacing, animal care, and route choices became more common. These were not dramatic confrontations, but persistent undercurrents. Fatigue reduced tolerance. Uncertainty narrowed perspective. Leadership became more complex. George Donner remained cautious, urging steady movement without risking animals further. James Reed pressed for efficiency, believing that delay was itself a threat. Their disagreements reflected genuine concern rather than personal rivalry, but they influenced the group's direction. Weather began to shift. Days grew shorter. Nights cooled more quickly. Frost appeared in low areas. These signs were noticed and discussed more openly now. The mountains ahead were no longer abstract features on the horizon, but obstacles tied directly to time. Children sensed the change. Their routines tightened. Play became less frequent. Adults spoke more softly in the evenings, aware that worry traveled easily. Despite everything, the group continued forward. No one yet believed the journey would fail entirely. There was still hope that the Sierra Nevada could be crossed before winter fully settled in. That belief, though strained, held the group together. But the margin for error had narrowed. Each day now carried weight, and the distance left to travel no longer felt theoretical. It felt urgent. As pressure increased, the cohesion of the group began to weaken. The journey no longer allowed for easy compromise. Every delay carried consequences, and every decision felt amplified by what had already been lost. Fatigue affected judgment. Hunger sharpened disagreement. Trust, once assumed, now had to be maintained deliberately. The conflict involving James Reed emerged from this strain. During a dispute over a damaged wagon and the handling of animals, tempers escalated beyond control. What might once have been resolved through discussion became physical. In the heat of the argument, Reed fatally wounded another member of the party. The act shocked the group. Violence was not part of their shared understanding of the journey. It disrupted whatever sense of order remained. The question of how to respond carried weight far beyond the incident itself. The group held counsel. There was no formal authority to enforce punishment, only collective judgment. Emotions ran high, but fear of division tempered rash action. Executing Reed would have fractured the party beyond repair. Allowing him to remain without consequence felt equally impossible. The decision was exile. James Reed was ordered to leave the group and attempt to reach California alone. He was given limited supplies and sent ahead, separated from his family and from the wagons that had carried him this far. The moment marked a turning point. The trail felt lonelier after his departure. The absence was practical as well as emotional. Reed had been a capable organizer. Losing him reduced the group's ability to manage conflict and logistics. Morale suffered quietly. Children noticed the change even if they did not understand its cause. Adults became more reserved. Conversations narrowed to immediate concerns. The journey continued, but something essential had shifted. The idea that the group would face every challenge together no longer felt certain. Survival began to feel more individual, even within the collective. As the wagons moved on, the mountains ahead seemed closer than ever. Winter was no longer a distant possibility. It was a presence that shaped every remaining mile. The Sierra Nevada mountains rose gradually into view, their outlines becoming clearer with each passing day. At first they appeared as distant ridges, blue and indistinct against the sky. But as the wagons drew nearer, the scale became undeniable. The mountains formed a continuous wall, their slopes heavy with forest and shadow. They were no longer an idea discussed around campfires. They were the next unavoidable stage of the journey. By now, it was late in the season. Experienced immigrants understood what that meant, even if they avoided speaking it aloud. Snow could fall early in the high passes. Once it did, wagons would not move, animals would struggle, roads would vanish beneath drifts. The pace increased where possible. Rest days were reduced. Camps were broken earlier in the morning and set later in the evening. Even so, the weakened oxen could not be pushed far beyond their limits. Every attempt to force progress risked losing animals entirely. The landscape grew more demanding. Rivers cut deeper channels. Trails climbed steadily. Forests thickened, forcing wagons into narrow clearings. Progress required careful coordination, especially on inclines where a single slip could overturn a wagon. Signs of winter appeared quietly. Frost lingered longer in shaded areas. Streams ran colder. Morning air carried a sharpness that had not been present weeks before. These details were noticed, measured, and then set aside, as if acknowledgement alone might invite disaster. Supplies were critically low. There was no longer enough food to allow for waste. Meals shrank. Hunting provided little relief. Game grew scarce as elevation increased and seasons shifted. The group reached the eastern foothills of the Sierra Nevada with little margin left. They had not failed yet. But the window to succeed was closing. Each mile now carried the weight of every decision made earlier in the journey. The shortcut, the delays, the desert, the conflict. All of it converged here at the base of the mountains. The wagons continued upward. Above them, the passes waited, narrow, steep, and vulnerable to the first heavy snowfall. And the sky, increasingly unpredictable, offered no assurances. The first snow did not arrive as a sudden disaster. It came quietly. Light flakes drifted down during the night, barely noticeable at first. By morning, the ground was dusted white. The outlines of wagons and trees softened rather than obscured. For a brief moment, the snowfall seemed manageable, even temporary. But it did not stop. As the day progressed, the snow thickened. The temperature dropped steadily. What had been damp ground became slick and unsteady beneath hooves and wheels. Wagons struggled for traction. Animals moved cautiously, their breath visible in the cold air. The group attempted to push forward. They had come too far to wait comfortably. Each hour of delay felt dangerous. But progress slowed to nearly nothing. Snow gathered faster than it could be cleared. Trails vanished as soon as they were made. By the following morning, drifts had formed. The wagons were hemmed in by forest and slope. The path ahead was no longer visible. The path behind was no better. The Sierra Nevada had closed around them with little warning. The realization settled gradually. They were no longer traveling. They were stopped. Camps were established out of necessity rather than choice. At Truckee Lake, near a frozen body of water bordered by trees, the main group halted. A short distance away, near Alder Creek, the Donner family settled where terrain allowed shelter. Shelter construction began immediately. Wagons were dismantled where necessary. Canvas was repurposed. Logs were cut despite numb hands and inadequate tools. Cabins were small, crude, and unfinished, but they offered protection from wind and snow. The snow continued to fall. Paths between shelters disappeared. Firewood became harder to gather as drifts deepened. Movement required effort that few could afford to waste. Animals suffered quickly. With grazing impossible, oxen were slaughtered for food. The decision was unavoidable and heavy with consequence. Each animal butchered reduced both food and future mobility. Inside the shelters, people adapted as best they could. Families slept close together to preserve warmth. Clothing was worn continuously. Fires were kept low to conserve fuel. Smoke lingered in enclosed spaces, irritating eyes and lungs. Time lost its usual markers. Days blurred together. Snowfall muffled sound. The landscape became still in a way that felt unnatural. The outside world seemed distant, unreachable. The group understood the situation clearly now. They would not cross the mountains that season. Winter had claimed them. What remained was endurance, measured not in miles but in days survived beneath an ever-deepening silence of snow. Once it became clear that movement was impossible, attention turned inward. The small shelters at Truckee Lake and Alder Creek were never intended to last an entire winter. They were built quickly, with limited tools and materials, shaped by necessity rather than comfort. Logs were stacked unevenly. Roofs were patched together from canvas, hides, and branches. Gaps were filled with mud and snow. Inside, space was scarce. Families shared single rooms. Some shelters housed more than one household. People slept side by side, wrapped in blankets that grew thinner with use and damp with condensation. Warmth became the central concern. Fires were kept burning whenever fuel allowed, though wood was difficult to gather. Snow lay deep between trees, and each trip outside demanded strength that was already fading. Firewood was cut close to camp when possible, but supplies dwindled quickly. Daily routines adjusted to confinement. Tasks that once filled hours now took minutes. Cooking was reduced to the simplest possible acts. Cleaning became impossible. Clothing stiffened from smoke and moisture. Everything smelled of ash, damp wood, and unwashed bodies. Silence settled over the camps. Snow absorbed sound. Wind moved through the trees without the sharpness of earlier storms. The stillness felt heavy, broken only by coughing, quiet conversation, or the crack of wood in a fire. Illness began to appear. Coughs lingered. Weakness spread unevenly. Minor injuries healed slowly or not at all. There were no remedies beyond rest and hope. Each illness threatened to become something more. Food was rationed carefully. The meat from slaughtered oxen was divided with precision. Bones were saved. Fat was rendered when possible. Every portion was measured against the unknown length of winter ahead. Children were watched closely. Their needs were prioritized where possible, though resources were limited. Adults went hungry more often than they admitted. Parents shared what little warmth and food they could provide. Time passed unevenly. Some days felt endless. Others disappeared quickly into exhaustion. There were no markers beyond the level of snow against the shelter walls, which crept higher with each storm. The outside world faded. There were no travelers, no messages, no sign that help was even possible. The mountains closed in around the camps, isolating them completely. Yet, within the shelters, people endured. They spoke quietly. They conserved energy. They waited. Winter had not yet reached its worst, but it had made its presence absolute. As winter deepened, hunger became constant rather than occasional. The supplies that had once seemed sufficient were now visibly shrinking. Each meal reduced the remaining stock in a way that could be counted and remembered. There were no opportunities to replace what was consumed. The mountains had sealed the camps completely. Rations were reduced again. Portions became smaller, then smaller still. What had once been a shared pot now held little more than broth. Meat was boiled repeatedly to draw out whatever nourishment remained. Bones were cracked and simmered. Nothing that might contain calories was discarded. The physical effects of hunger appeared gradually. Strength faded. Movement slowed. Simple tasks required rest afterward. People spoke less, conserving energy even in conversation. The cold felt sharper as bodies lost the ability to generate heat. Children weakened visibly. Their faces grew thin. Their movements became cautious. Adults watched them constantly, aware that illness or injury would now be difficult to survive. Parents gave up their own portions quietly, pretending not to notice the loss. The slaughter of remaining animals continued as long as possible. Hides were boiled. Fat was scraped and saved. Even these measures provided only temporary relief. With each animal lost, the future narrowed further. The environment offered little assistance. Snow buried any trace of plant life. Hunting was nearly impossible. The forest stood silent, empty of movement. What food existed was already inside the shelters, finite and dwindling. Emotional strain increased. People argued quietly, then stopped arguing altogether. There was little energy for blame. Most understood that the situation was the result of many choices layered over time, not a single mistake. Deaths began to occur. At first, they came after illness. Later, they followed weakness alone. Each loss altered the balance of the camps. Spaces emptied. Fires burned lower. The presence of death became unavoidable. Decisions were made without discussion. Bodies were moved outside. Snow covered them quickly. The cold preserved what could not be buried. These acts were carried out with restraint, without ceremony. Hunger did not arrive as a single moment of crisis. It settled in slowly. It shaped thought, movement, and memory. It stripped life down to the simplest concern, continuing to exist from one day to the next. Winter pressed on, and with it, the understanding that survival would require choices no one had imagined when the road west first began. By midwinter, the camps existed in a state of suspension. Snow lay several feet deep, reshaped daily by wind and drifting. The shelters were half buried now, their outlines softened and distorted. Doors required constant clearing. Light entered only briefly, filtering through small openings before fading again. Movement outside was rare. Cold air burned the lungs. Snow swallowed footsteps. Each trip for firewood or water demanded effort that weakened bodies could barely provide. People went out only when necessary and never alone. Inside the shelters, time slowed further. There was little left to do. Tools sat unused. Clothing no longer needed repair. It was worn continuously. Hands rested in laps, eyes closed more often than they opened. Sleep came easily, not from comfort, but from exhaustion. Hunger deepened. The body adjusted in quiet, dangerous ways. Thoughts dulled, emotions flattened, pain faded into background sensation. Even fear lost its sharpness, replaced by a heavy awareness of limitation. Conversations became infrequent. When people spoke, it was softly and briefly. There was no energy for storytelling or planning beyond the next meal. Words were chosen carefully, if at all. The cold reshaped everything. Water froze inside containers. Breath condensed on blankets. Frost formed along interior walls. Fires, when lit, were kept low to conserve fuel. Smoke lingered, irritating eyes and throats, but was tolerated for warmth. Death became part of the environment. Those who passed were often already weakened beyond recovery. Their absence altered the rhythm of the shelters. Fewer voices, more space, less warmth shared between bodies. No one spoke openly about the future. Spring existed only as an idea, too distant to rely upon. Rescue was not discussed. Survival was reduced to the present moment. Outside, storms came and went without announcement. Snow fell steadily, then stopped, then fell again. The mountains remained unmoved, indifferent to the struggle beneath them. Deep winter held the camps firmly, and within that stillness the Donner Party endured, not with hope or confidence, but with a quiet persistence shaped by necessity rather than expectation. As winter tightened its hold, it became clear that waiting alone would not be enough. The remaining food could not sustain everyone until spring. Strength continued to fade. Each day of stillness increased the risk that no one would be able to leave at all. The camps existed in a narrowing window of possibility. The idea of sending a small group out had been discussed before, then set aside. Now it returned with urgency. Those chosen were not the strongest in absolute terms, but those still capable of movement. Men and women volunteered knowing the risk. The goal was simple: cross the mountains on foot, reach settlements to the west, and bring help back. They prepared with what little was available. Improvised snowshoes were fashioned from ox bows and rawhide. Clothing was layered despite its wear. Small amounts of food were divided carefully, knowing it would never be enough. Each item carried had to justify its weight. On December 16, 1846, 15 people left the camps. They moved quietly, without ceremony. There were no speeches. Goodbyes were brief. Everyone understood what was being asked of them, and what might be lost. The snow was deep from the first step. Progress was slow and uneven. Snowshoes sank. Slopes forced detours. The cold was relentless, draining strength with every movement. Nights offered little rest, as sleep brought dangerous exposure. Food disappeared quickly. Rations were consumed earlier than planned. Hunting was impossible. Hunger returned with intensity, layered over exhaustion and cold. The group pressed on regardless, aware that stopping would end the attempt entirely. Deaths began within days. Those who collapsed could not be carried. The decision to leave them behind was made in silence. The living continued forward, knowing that delay endangered everyone. As conditions worsened, desperation replaced planning. When members of the group died, their bodies were not left untouched. The decision to consume the dead was not discussed in moral terms. It was a response to starvation, recorded later without embellishment. The mountains offered no relief. Storms obscured direction. Snow erased tracks. progress became erratic, guided by instinct rather than certainty. Strength ebbed with each mile. After weeks of suffering, the group fragmented further. Some could no longer continue. Others pushed on despite failing bodies. Of the original 15, only 7 would reach the settlements in California. When they finally descended from the mountains, they were scarcely recognizable. Emaciated, frostbitten, and barely able to speak, they carried a message shaped by suffering rather than words. Help was needed, and it was needed immediately. After the forlorn hope disappeared into the mountains, the camps fell into a deeper quiet. Those left behind understood what the departure meant. The attempt was their only chance for rescue, but it was also a fragile one. There was no way to know if the group would succeed, or if any of them would survive the crossing at all. Life in the shelters narrowed further. Food was nearly gone. What remained was divided with care, though portions were now so small that the act felt symbolic more than sustaining. Hunger was constant, no longer sharp, but heavy and dull. The cold persisted. Snow continued to fall intermittently, adding to drifts that pressed against cabin walls. Clearing doorways required effort few could spare. Some shelters became nearly sealed, their occupants moving only inside. Illness spread quietly. Weak bodies were more vulnerable. Coughs deepened. Wounds failed to heal. Those who fell ill rarely recovered. Death came without struggle, often during sleep. The dead were moved outside when possible. Snow covered them quickly, preserving what could not be buried. These acts were carried out without ritual. The energy required for mourning no longer existed. As starvation worsened, decisions once unthinkable became unavoidable. Those who died were not always left untouched. This occurred without violence, without discussion, and without justification beyond survival. Later accounts recorded these actions plainly, without detail. Children were watched constantly. Adults intervened where possible, sharing what little warmth and food remained. Parents weakened faster than their children, often deliberately. These choices were not spoken of. The passage of time became difficult to track. Days were measured by light and darkness rather than by count. Snowfall erased external markers. The future felt unreachable. Hope persisted unevenly. Some believed help would come. Others no longer expected it. Most existed somewhere between these positions, focused only on the present moment. The mountains remained silent. No movement broke the horizon. No sound carried from beyond the camps. The world beyond the snow felt unreal. Still, the camps endured, not through planning or optimism, but through the simplest act of remaining alive, one quiet day at a time, waiting for something, anything, to change. Far beyond the mountains, the message carried by the survivors of the forlorn hope finally reached settled land. Those who arrived in the Sacramento Valley did so slowly, often supported by others. Their condition made explanation difficult. They were weak, emaciated, and marked by frostbite and exhaustion. What they described was not dramatic in tone, but urgent in substance. A rescue effort began cautiously. Winter still held the high passes. Snow remained deep. Any attempt to cross the mountains carried risk not only to those trapped, but to the rescuers themselves. Preparations took time, and time was already scarce. The first relief party set out in late January 1847. They traveled on snowshoes, carrying limited supplies and driven by necessity rather than confidence. Progress was slow. Storms forced delays. The mountains resisted passage as they always had. When the rescuers finally reached the eastern slopes, the signs of suffering appeared immediately. Abandoned wagons stood half buried in snow. Tracks led nowhere. The forest was silent. It was clear that movement had ceased months earlier. At Truckee Lake, the rescuers found the camps. Shelters were nearly buried. Smoke no longer rose from all of them. Those still alive emerged slowly, weakened and cautious. Unsure at first whether what they were seeing was real, the condition of the survivors confirmed the urgency. Many could not walk unassisted. Children were carried. Adults moved with visible effort. Supplies brought by the rescuers provided brief relief, but there was not enough to move everyone at once. Decisions had to be made immediately. The weakest were prioritized. Children were selected first, followed by those most likely to survive the return journey. Others were told they would have to wait for another party. These separations were quiet and restrained. There was no argument. Those left behind understood the limitations. The hope now lay in the promise that help had finally arrived, and that more would follow. The first group of survivors was escorted westward. The journey out was slow and dangerous. Snowstorms continued. Exhaustion claimed some along the way. Not everyone who left the camp survived the passage to safety. Behind them, others remained. But the silence had been broken. Winter had not yet released its hold, but the isolation was no longer absolute. The Donner Party was no longer alone. Relief had begun, not as a single moment of rescue, but as a difficult, uneven process that would stretch on for months. The first relief party did not end the ordeal. Winter still controlled the mountains, and the number of people trapped far exceeded what could be moved in a single effort. Snow remained deep. Weather shifted unpredictably. Each rescue attempt required the same dangerous crossing that had trapped the emigrants in the first place. Those left behind waited in altered circumstances. They now knew that the outside world existed again. That knowledge brought both comfort and strain. Hope returned unevenly, tempered by hunger and weakness. Supplies left by the rescuers helped briefly, but could not sustain the camps for long. Additional rescue parties were organized as conditions allowed. Each departure from the California side depended on weather, available manpower, and supplies. Snowshoes were repaired. Food was gathered sparingly. No one underestimated the risk now. When the next party reached the camps, the scene had changed again. More shelters stood empty. Fires burned lower. Survivors were fewer and weaker. The winter had continued its work without pause, even after help had begun. Evacuations were slow and painful. Those selected to leave often lacked the strength to walk. They were supported, carried, or guided step by step. Children were wrapped tightly and passed between rescuers. Adults moved with visible effort, aware that stopping could be fatal. Some resisted leaving loved ones behind. These moments were resolved quietly. There were no alternatives. Space and supplies were limited. The mountains imposed their own rules. Along the route west, losses continued. Storms struck without warning. Exhaustion overcame some who had survived the winter only to collapse on the journey out. The rescue parties did what they could, but conditions allowed little mercy. Each return trip brought news. Those who reached safety spoke of who remained behind. Supplies were adjusted, plans changed. The rescue effort became a sequence of cautious advances rather than a single operation. By early spring, the snow began to soften. Travel became marginally easier. Days grew longer. The passes, though still dangerous, were no longer completely sealed. These changes allowed rescuers to reach those who had waited the longest. The camps emptied slowly. What remained were abandoned shelters, scattered belongings, and signs of prolonged survival under extreme conditions. The presence of people faded, replaced by stillness. The long rescue concluded not with celebration, but with exhaustion. Those who survived were changed in ways that could not be measured immediately. The journey had ended, but its effects would persist far beyond the mountains that had contained it. By early April of 1847, winter began to loosen its grip on the Sierra Nevada. Snow still covered the high ground, but it no longer fell relentlessly. The air softened during the day. Water began to move beneath the ice. These changes were subtle, but they altered what was possible. The final rescue parties reached the camps under these shifting conditions. What they found was quiet. Most shelters stood empty. Fires were cold. Belongings lay where they had been dropped weeks earlier. The presence of life was limited to a few weakened individuals who had survived by enduring rather than acting. Those remaining were in critical condition. Many could no longer stand without assistance. Illness and prolonged starvation had left lasting damage. Even simple movements exhausted them. The effort required to leave the camps rivaled the effort it had taken to survive the winter itself. Evacuation was careful and deliberate. Rescuers moved slowly, choosing routes that minimized risk rather than distance. Survivors were supported on both sides, their steps guided through snow that still reached knee-height in places. Along the descent, the environment changed again. Trees thinned. Snow gave way to patches of exposed ground. Water flowed freely in streams that had been frozen for months. These signs marked a return to movement, though not to ease. Not everyone survived the journey out. Some who had endured the winter succumbed to exhaustion along the trail. Their bodies were left where they fell, marked when possible, but rarely buried deeply enough to last beyond the season. By late April, the last survivors reached settled areas. They arrived quietly. There were no announcements, no public reception. They were taken in by families and communities who provided shelter, food, and rest. Recovery, when it occurred at all, was slow. The camps were left behind. Snow continued to melt around the abandoned shelters. Roofs sagged, logs shifted, belongings scattered by animals and weather. The place where people had endured so much returned gradually to forest and silence. Of the nearly 90 who had begun the journey, fewer than half survived. The numbers were recorded later, but at the time, survival was counted individually. Each person who reached safety represented a singular outcome, shaped by chance, endurance, and timing. The expedition was over. What remained was memory. Fragmented, uneven, and difficult to speak about. The road west had ended, not in arrival but in understanding of how easily progress could be undone by environment, delay, and decision. Spring moved forward, and the mountains, unchanged, remained where they had always been. When the last rescue party descended from the mountains, the Sierra Nevada returned to quiet. Snow continued to melt through late spring, feeding streams that ran clear and fast. The passes opened again, gradually, without ceremony. The landscape resumed its seasonal rhythm, indifferent to what had occurred beneath its weight only weeks before. For the survivors, recovery did not follow the same rhythm. Many were unable to resume ordinary life. Their bodies had been altered by prolonged starvation and cold. Strength returned slowly, if at all. Illness lingered. Some never fully recovered, carrying weakness and pain for the rest of their lives. Emotional recovery proved more complicated. What had been endured was difficult to describe and harder to share. Survivors often avoided speaking of the winter entirely. When they did, accounts varied, shaped by memory, shame, and distance from the events themselves. Families were reshaped permanently. Some children survived without parents. Some parents returned without children. These absences defined lives long after the journey ended. Decisions made under extreme conditions were remembered unevenly, sometimes defended, sometimes regretted. Public attention followed briefly. Newspapers reported the story, often emphasizing its most shocking elements. Details were simplified. Context was lost. The complexity of survival under extreme conditions was reduced to spectacle in some retellings. For the survivors, this attention was unwelcome. Many withdrew from public discussion. Some changed their names. Others moved away from places where questions were asked too easily. Silence became a form of protection. The trail west continued to be used. Other immigrants passed through the same region in later years, often unaware of the precise locations where the camps had stood. Wagons crossed Donner Pass in better seasons, guided by improved knowledge and infrastructure. Yet the story remained. It circulated as warning rather than inspiration. It reminded travelers that preparation mattered, that shortcuts carried risk, and that the environment could not be negotiated with. The snow melted completely. Grass returned. Trees healed their broken branches. The marks of shelters faded quickly, reclaimed by forest and weather. What could not be erased so easily was the memory carried by those who survived, a memory shaped not by movement or progress, but by stillness, endurance, and the long wait for relief. The mountains remained, and the lesson, though rarely spoken aloud, endured with them. In time, the Donner Party passed from lived experience into history. The cabins collapsed under their own weight. Snow returned each winter, covering the ground where wagons had once stood. Trees grew where paths had been cut. Animals moved through the area without awareness of what had occurred there before. The land did not preserve memory in human ways. It held no markers for suffering or endurance. It did not distinguish between years of ease and years of loss. Seasons followed one another with consistency, governed by altitude and climate rather than consequence. Yet the story remained. It was carried forward through journals, testimonies, and later retellings. Some details were emphasized. Others faded. What survived depended on who spoke and who listened. For those who encountered the story later, it became a lesson. Not a lesson about bravery alone, nor about failure. It was a reminder of limits, of how preparation, timing, and restraint mattered as much as ambition. Of how decisions made far from danger could determine outcomes months later. The West continued to draw people. Routes improved. Passes were mapped more carefully. Supply points were established. Knowledge accumulated slowly, built from experience rather than optimism. The Donner Party became part of that knowledge, not as a symbol to be admired or dismissed, but as evidence of what could happen when environment, delay, and human judgment intersected under pressure. Today, the mountains appear unchanged. They rise as they always have, indifferent to traffic and history alike. Snow still falls early in some years. Storms still arrive without warning. Distance still misleads those who underestimated. What the mountains keep is not memory, but reality. They hold to their conditions regardless of who approaches them or why. They allow passage when seasons align. They deny it when they do not. The Donner Party did not conquer the Sierra Nevada. They encountered it, and in that encounter, they revealed something enduring, not about the land, but about human vulnerability when movement becomes impossible and time runs out. The road west ended in stillness. The snow melted. Life continued, and the mountains remained silent and unchanged. Long after the wagons, the shelters, and the voices had disappeared from their slopes,